Okay, so the African Union in 2012 estimated that there are more than 112 million um, people in the diaspora, Africans in the diaspora, in South America alone, with over 14 million of those in Brazil, but with growing numbers in Colombia, Venezuela, and about 30.9 million in North America, mainly in the USA and Canada. And today there are over 46 million Africans in the USA of diaspora definition. And then, of course, about over 5 million in Europe, and so forth and so on. And so the figures are really high when it comes to the Africans in the diaspora. But there's another diaspora, which is Africans living outside the country of their birth, but within the continent. And these are estimated to be around 34 million. It's forecasted that by 2050, there might be over 100 million Africans living outside countries of their own birth, but in the continent. This implies that migration plays a huge role in shaping Africa's future. For example, remittances to sub-Saharan Africa grew almost 10% to 46 billion in 2018, with significant flows coming from within Africa. For example, Benin is said to be receiving over 130 million US dollars each year from Nigeria, and nearly 60 million US dollars is said to be coming from Congo to this country. This is not just in person-to-person flows that we are looking at today, but also exchanges in business, but also through geopolitical considerations. From Ghana's year of return to Ethiopia's recent diaspora trust fund, more governments across the continent are finding new ways to engage the diaspora in the development agenda. The power of the Africans in the diaspora lies also in their duality. They identify with often more than one culture, and they act as a bridge to having lived experiences of understanding the true African experience and communicating applicable efforts and successes that can be scaled up in meaningful ways. Utilizing this duality can help in a number of areas. Unfortunately, many opportunities for the diaspora to contribute to the development of the continent remain unexploited, largely because of the lack of proper coordination. We have assembled a very experienced panel to address how the diaspora can be a source of development and a force for African philanthropists to close the gender gap. In this session, we are going to examine and highlight how to strategically engage the African diaspora and drive support towards gender equality space. Last night, I think those who were here, we heard at the launch of the Africa Gender Fund that even though financial resources are crucial and needed, ideas, networks, and other resources are equally important too. The center that I run, CAPSI, studies various typologies of philanthropy, and we are convinced that philanthropy, while defined as voluntary action for public good, takes different forms and functions depending on context. This session, therefore, takes a broader look at forms of philanthropy in centering the diaspora. Please welcome me introduce my panelists, starting with Rashida on the far end, who is the CEO and founder of 1847 Philanthropic. And then I want to introduce Pauline Wanja, next to Rashida, who is the CEO of Future First. And lastly but not the least, Omolola Adele also, who is the founder, Diaspora Rise Up. So let's give them a hand of applause, please. Okay, so I'm happy that you could all make it here. Rashida, I'm hoping that you are good to go, given the long flight that you took. If anything happens and you fall asleep, we've agreed that Omolola will take care of the business. So let me start with you, Omolola. You are the founder and chief executive of LOS Lifestyle, an African travel concierge celebrating the stories of Africa by increasing visibility and access to history, culture, and exploration. But prior to this, you served as the executive director and co-founder of Act for Accountability, a non-profit African diaspora organization that's committed to building a culture of accountability among Africans and the diaspora through civic engagement. We'll come back and talk more about your work, but how better can we engage the diaspora and harness it to address systemic challenges, especially as they face women and girls in Africa?
Well, thank you guys. Thank you, APF and my panelists. So to answer that question, I want to start a little bit about how I fell into philanthropy. I think Mr. Oyeboade said it's always been in our culture, right? We've always been giving, we've always been doing the work, but we just never defined it as philanthropy. But 2014 changed for me when the girls in Chibok were kidnapped. And that I saw as a rallying cry, as an opportunity to be able to rally resources, to be able to support IDP individuals in camps, but specifically targeting young girls' education. And so we created Act for Accountability as a vehicle to be able to organize our diaspora and to be able to rally funds and other resources that we could connecting with local NGOs on the ground who knew what they needed. And I think it's very important to talk about people know what they need, but they need people to hear them and for them to be able to galvanize and coordinate it. And so we did that. We went to churches, we went to associations, we went to other Nigeria-specific and larger Africa diaspora organizations and raised money to be able to support local NGOs that we were able to vet, and we were able to pass through unrestricted funding to them. And that was a very, very critical and eye-opening way for us to say, what if there was a way to structure and create a vehicle that does some of the heavy lifting for the organizations to be able to access alternative funding versus just traditional grant-making resources or foundations that may not see them or may not understand their actual critical needs.
So can I just have a follow-up question? I mean, earlier I referred to some of the figures around remittances.
Yeah.
And all of us, normally when we think of the diaspora, we think of remittances.
Correct.
But actually there's more to
Yes.
the diaspora than remittances. But let's start there. In your view, what is the role of remittances beyond at times what we see to be, I'm giving money but back to my family?
Remittances create access to alternative credit. So for people who have small micro businesses who can't access credit through banks or other resources, by engaging your diaspora, by asking people for money, you're actually able to invest. I've invested in other people's businesses when I was living in the States who just wanted to do a friends and family round, did $5,000 or even less. They just needed that little bit. And sometimes you get your returns, but sometimes, you're investing in somebody else's dream or somebody else's ability to create jobs for other people. And that is one of the ways in which remittances beyond individual giving of, education, healthcare, or living expenses can actually support growth.
Yeah. So Rashida, let me come to you. I would like to ask you the same question. But in your response, can you tell us a bit about what 1847 Philanthropic does? This year alone, I read from your resume that you have raised over 25 million US dollars for your clients in the USA. You have also worked both in this continent and in North America, giving you the best of both worlds. So again, how can we leverage and engage the diaspora and also link it to the need to close the gender gap?
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me, and thank you to the African Philanthropy Forum. So 1847, I'm a fundraiser. I raise money. That's the easiest way to kind of cut to the chase. And I'm a philanthropic advisor, so I work with foundations and help them advise their theories of change and fund locally. And I should say that I consider the African diaspora everyone Black, so I'm going to include myself in that. I'm originally from the Caribbean, but lived in the U.S. for many years. In terms of the diaspora, I think Lola made a very interesting point and about just the natural connection and the fact that most communities of color are just naturally philanthropic because we have to be. Because we've been excluded from mainstream economies for so long that many of us just have found ways to to share, to create community, to support businesses. Remittances fund huge parts of education, I know, in the Caribbean and also in the African continent. As an advisor for a lot of foundations in the US, many times, I think the most important role for the diaspora necessarily in, outside of the continent is really to amplify and be that person in the room, because in many instances, we are just not there. And I think that that's increasingly becoming important, in addition to just, the remittances and the money, which is very, very important. Trust me, I know, as a fundraiser, money is a lot. But I think that also being a presence and being there is equally important.
So before we go to Pauline, I just want to ask both of you, you have both alluded to the importance of the remittances, but how can they be structured? Because we can still have the flow of these funds to the continent, but not going to the areas that are needed most. And in this case, we're talking about closing the gender gap. How can they be structured? We start with you, Rashid, and come to you, Omolwa.
Sure. So that's a really important point. I think recently, the gentleman before was mentioning something about tax incentives. And that's 100% true, that most philanthropy or individuals in the US get tax benefits for their philanthropic giving, and it's a huge part of the reason why people give. There's a vehicle called a donor advised fund that, we're all in philanthropy here, so probably know of it. There is an African American Yvonne Moore, who recently created a donor advised fund specifically for the African diaspora in the US, and so has been doing quite well. So that's a vehicle. There are traditional ones like, Tides and others, other donor advised funds where basically you can take the tax benefit today and then trickle down your giving over time. There's also collaboratives, and also there's an entity in the United States that's called African Philanthropy Month. That's an organization that also puts together giving circles, so it's sort of more community. I'm in one, a group of sisters that come together, and we raise about $10,000 of our personal funds, and then we give it out, we vote. So there's lots of different ways to do it. I think that the targets and how much marketing and sort of access, we need to do probably a better job at that.
Yeah.
And just to add up that to what Rashida said, that was why we created Diaspora Rise Up. So we created it as a vehicle to actually raise money and have a structure in which we could identify organizations. We started off using it as emergency funding. So there was a flood in Sierra Leone, in Nigeria. So we were able to do a lot of vetting, and that's one of the challenges, is identifying the organizations that should get the money or should get the funds and can deliver and implement on whatever plans and ideas that they have. So we created Diaspora Rise Up as a way to raise money, not just from the Nigerian diaspora, but across multiple diasporas, and it was the Ethiopian diaspora, and Sierra Leonean diaspora, in being able to really help them think through how they wanted to use their resources. They all know people, they all know different ways, but they wanted some accountability, they wanted some transparency as to where the money was going and who's getting the money, and to make sure that there was documentation on, all right, we've given $20,000 towards this particular group. We need to see that there's something done with that fund.
Pauline, over the last 10 years, you've been very much involved, and you've played a huge role in shaping alumni engagement in Kenyan high schools. And you have also partnered with the government. And I think yesterday there was a lot about policy influence and how policies either hinder or facilitate systems change. You are currently working to expand alumni programs with Kenyans in the diaspora. Can you also share your reflections on the same question around how the diaspora can be harnessed and the role that you think remittances can play in your particular context. But I also read that in your recent research, you established that 30% of alumni did not give in 2019 because there was no program to give to. And about 22% wanted to give, but they did not have a platform to do so. I suppose the issue of coordination that was raised in the overview of the session also requires attention. Can we have your thoughts on those issues?
Thank you so much for...
Is it on? I think there's a button there.
Sorry. Thank you so much for the introduction. So our specific area of philanthropy is alumni giving, and across the board, it's not something new. It happens, but like most other giving across the continent, it's not strategic. There's no structure or framework to encourage it. And when you talk about remittances, I think the last one in Kenya around 2019, 14% of all the remittances went to paying into education. So there's an opportunity to create a framework that would allow people in diaspora to properly give. I think to give an example of there not being a structure, I can give a story of my serendipity date this morning. So the moment I said I work with alumni, she picks her phone and shows me something X89 fund. So as a group of girls in Uganda, they've come together to raise funds to support their old school. But she said something that still points to this. They cannot raise so much money because it will raise questions. So that means they're not able to do as much because there's no regulatory framework to manage the alumni giving. And we've seen that is the same in Kenya as well. We have the initial data was a global data on propensity of adults to give back to the school. This was done globally, so touching on local alumni and diaspora. 52% of adults say they'd give back to their old school, with only 2% doing that. So we've gone a step back to ask, why are you not doing that? And it's consistently the question of there not being a structure. So I think with around diaspora, it's more strategic connection and creating that structure that would allow giving. You mentioned what we've been able to do with the Kenyan government. So in 2019, we launched a mentorship policy that institutionalized an annual alumni mentorship day. This is one of some of the frameworks now we're creating. And the idea for going with government is mentorship plays a key role, and that has come a lot. But then we are leaving in that to chance. So how do we, besides money, how do we even mobilize alumni in diaspora to provide that mentorship that most young people in the continent need?
So the infrastructure, oh, okay, please go for it. Yeah.
I think it's important to talk about community. We don't, and not being asked. You'd be amazed how many people are not asked, would you give? And they would say yes in a heartbeat. But how can I give? How do I know that if I give you $100,000 because I want to do more on the continent? I see how charitable organizations in the United States, granted we have the 501c3 tax credits and all these things, but people would still give regardless of it being a tax benefit, but they just don't know how. They also want to make sure that the money that they're given actually is used for the end purpose. But it's really important that a lot of people and a lot of organizations on the continent don't reach out to the diaspora. They don't reach out to their local ethnic diaspora, their church affiliations or religious affiliations, schools, alumni, and that's a lot of resources that are not being utilized, whether it's in funding or in talent.
Yeah. So I wanted to continue with you, Pauline, on the infrastructure that you are now developing.
Yes.
How can you scale that to other countries? But I'm also interested in how we can scale it in such a way that it takes into account some of the vulnerable groups, young girls in particular.
I would think, especially for alumni, the school plays a key role. For most of you, if you went to schools abroad, every other time you receive an email on how you can engage. But our schools are not doing that. So we see one way we can scale is actually by building those infrastructure within school. Then we're not leaving this engagement to chance. So yeah, I would.
So yesterday, I don't know if I heard very well. I heard that the Africa Gender Initiative is seeking to raise, was it 50 million? 50 million in five years. I want us to think about that because Rashida has just raised 25 million this year alone. And why should we take 5 years to raise 50 million?
Okay, but so let me speak on that. I've been raising for 15, so I think that sometimes, I think that having big goals is really important. I think that asking is very important. I actually really, really like what Pauline is doing with the alumni, because if you think about all of these endowments, Harvard's, Yale's, all of these universities that a lot of the heads of governments and heads of businesses have gone to, that is where you get your core fundraisers. It has started, starts in church, obviously, with, giving tithes. But then the second is actually schools and education. We understand giving through that, right? And so, and giving small through that. And I think that, yes, there are large foundations that give millions and millions of dollars each year, but actually if you look at the giving statistics, 80% of giving, and I think last year was $243 billion was given philanthropically around the world, comes from individuals, 80%. So yes, foundations and corporates and all of these things have a role to play, but actually, in fact, 80%, your largest pool of potential funding is going to come from individuals. So you need an engagement strategy, and this alumni piece is super, super important because you need the ability to train, we need the ability to train fundraisers in the continent to understand the cultural context, to understand engagement, to understand stewardship and cultivation and making the ask, which is super important to get to that 50 million.
Yeah, so what I'm getting at, let's use the fund, the Africa Gender Initiative as a case for support. How can you help this audience and the organizers to think about raising that money in less than 5 years?
I mean, I guess I'll start since I'm the fundraiser on the panel. Well, I like what you said about the case for support because most successful campaigns really start there. You have to have a really clearly articulated aspirational vision that people can buy in and see themselves in it. And that's like the number one rule that you learn as a successful fundraiser is like people have to see themselves in order to understand specifically where they fit in a campaign and what their role is going to be. And so we would have to look at that and see what the levels are. So what are the levels that the fund is offering? Are they looking at raising like 5 million per innovator or the accelerator? You come up with all of these like marketing tools, but the reason why you come up with those tools is that so that people can actually envision themselves and understand where they fit in. So 5 million to 10 million is this role, so we are going to go after these prospects for that particular level, and then from there down. So that's how, without knowing much about the fund, and I'm sure it's together, but that's how you would actually go about securing those larger gifts and then wrapping around smaller gifts around that as you go down.
Yeah. And those from you and then Paula.
And I think with the smaller giving opportunities, so one of the things, when we talk about gender equality, sometimes everything seems so big, right? It seems unattainable when you just talk about it. You talk about statistics and things, but one of the things we've learned is when you talk to people on, let's say, identity-based, right? I think which is some of what Rashid is saying, community-based. So if I'm speaking to a Nigerian and I'm saying, you know what, there's this initiative, and this is how it affects us as Nigerians, affects Nigerian women, affects Nigerian children, affects Nigeria's economy. you're more likely to connect on the more of the individual giving side that can contribute to a larger vehicle. So the campaign has to have multiple levels. It's not just targeting, World Banks or higher endowment organizations, but how can the individual level, the small giver, the small philanthropist, the everyday philanthropist also buy into this vehicle and give, and that they can see that, all right, I'm part of something bigger, but I'm starting from where I am.
Yeah. Pauline?
Since I work a lot with individual givers, there's a segment of women we always leave behind. These are women in corporates. They're probably not necessarily the beneficiaries of our program, but then they're left with no way to give. So how do we reach out to more women, especially in the corporate sector, that are looking for an avenue to support or give that we haven't traditionally done?
Yeah, I have 3 more questions, but we're really running out of time. So you choose the one that speaks to you nicely. So the first is, can you provide specific cases of the diaspora involving in service of gender equality on the continent beyond the provision of money? The second is, how can we engage the generationally removed members of the diaspora as we work to close the gender gap in Africa? And then the third is there room for collaboration between the diaspora and funders on the continent? So you can choose. If you want to address all 3, it's up to you, but just choose the one that speaks to you.
I know Rashida may talk about money, but I also want to talk about funders.
Sure.
Research. We talked about data, I think, a few sessions yesterday. There's still a lot of data that needs to be understood about the Black giving philanthropy, African diaspora philanthropy. The research is quite dated on understanding how we give, where we give, the vehicles that we're giving to and through, but we need to do more research. We also need funders who are here, donors who are here, to talk to your counterparts in the West about funding diaspora organizations. When we were doing our project, Rashida and I worked together, as you can probably tell. We had such a hard time in finding funders in the West who would buy into this idea and this vision. MasterCard Foundation did. We were lucky. But overwhelmingly, people were like, it's a nice to have. Or it's nice that you're doing that. But that's not our area of interest.
Yeah. But what I was hearing, though, I had differently, but what I'm hearing is that you have more chances of raising more money from individuals than from organizations.
But we had to do both.
Yeah.
Yeah. So you can't yet, while our focus was Africans for Africa, in order to scale, you also need to look at the ecosystem. And so you can't just say we're only going to do this.
Yeah.
If we're talking about scale, we need everybody. And it's in the inclusion of everybody that we realize that we're actually on the outside of the philanthropic world.
Yeah.
Probably just to give an example of what more women can do, especially in the space, I think use mentorship, trying to mobilize many women, especially in the diaspora, to mentor and support young people. And I probably can quickly answer into the question of funding. So I think the African Union declared African in diaspora as a 6th region. So there's an opportunity for all these different diaspora forum to coordinate and just make a case for supporting diaspora or build a proper infrastructure for that. So, yeah.
I'd like to touch on the collaboration between diaspora and funders. I think it's really important, especially what Lola said. We had a really hard time. We were a little early, I think, in the course of things, but people were not quite there yet to understand what really the role could be, like just opening up the mindset of what role could the diaspora play in philanthropic giving outside of just remittances, which dominates a lot of the conversation. I also would like to talk about boards. So I think that what is really, really important is board members. And I think that a lot of foundations, this is going to be corporate, also family foundations, should look at diaspora members to be part of their boards. I think that that would actually really, really change the conversation. A lot of family foundations and a lot of entities that are providing lots of funding in the United States do not have any people who look like them, the people who they are funding, on their boards, and that is a problem. So I think that that's, the number one thing that would help. Also, hiring local consultants. So I've noticed that a lot of foundations, some of them have hired me, so I would gladly give up my spot for a local consultant on the continent any day of the week, because I think that that's just really important. To have that perspective is really important to pass that money. A lot of philanthropic advisors get paid a lot of money, and that money needs to be coming to the continent. So when looking at hiring advisors, hiring consultants, look local first. And then also, I think we have to change our mindset in terms of who you see when you think of philanthropy. And that's an ongoing conversation that we need to be having, because a lot of people don't see people of color.
Yeah. So, and I know we need to get to the audience, but we've been addressing the diaspora as in the global north. And like I said in my opening remarks, there's the diaspora within the continent. How can we engage those? And like I said, the projections are that in terms of remittances, we are actually going to be getting more from the diaspora within the continent than from without. And so how do we engage those in the continent?
I mean, I'll say, for example, I'm part of business networks, right? So moving back to Nigeria, I was trying to find my own community, in a sense. We've raised money, we've given money in many different ways to many different entities. Some have been NGOs, some have been social impact businesses. And that's bringing Forex into a vehicle, or maybe what we call them, they're not giving circles, but there's a structure around it, where we actually, not necessarily SUSIs, but like an investment fund. So local business networks are creating investment funds where someone can come pitch, and if you're interested, and we always try to make sure, I'm on one of the governing councils, and so I would always like to make sure that there is always a project that we are funding that has something to do with gender. So that's one of the ways in which people who are so-called returnees are doing their part, because they're coming with money, they're coming with expertise, experience, and they're supporting local organizations and local individuals who are the ones on the front line of the work.
I'd say building an infrastructure and making the ask, because even for the returnees, like you come back and you have to think about the infrastructure or coalesce other people around the cost. So if the initiatives already exist, then that would create an opportunity they can just plug into.
Yeah, I think making the ask, having the vehicles, and at the end of the day, like, successful fundraising has to do with the individual, right? Even if you're in a foundation structure, it's like the individual, what is their purpose and what are they looking to do? And I think that that's what makes things successful, when you're able to provide that vehicle or that benefit for that particular donor. And many times, I think local organizations somewhat struggle with that, because they're used to the grant-making side. And so it's really flipped when you're looking at individuals. It really is about like that person, that individual, the nice things that, the little touches, the notes, the thank you cards, things like that, the small things that you wouldn't necessarily, that take a lot of time, frankly. The phone call on birthdays, I've had donors who I've called and just, hey, I want to, wish you a happy birthday. And that's it. No ask, no nothing. Just remembering, these small details about individuals is important, especially when you're looking at people who are maybe back and forths are what I call them. Like they're in the diaspora, but they're somewhere else. They may be living in South Africa. They may be living, a different place from where they're actually from.
Okay, great. So let's see if we can take a couple of questions. We have a few minutes to pose questions to the panelists. Let's see by show of hands. Any questions to the panelists?
That will be on 26th. We have a shuttle at 11 p.m.
Okay, there's a hand over there. Where is the mic? Okay.
Good afternoon. Thank you for an engaging discussion. My interest is on the diaspora supporting established philanthropic organizations, the likes of how Gates and Buffett would say, I want to give, I don't want to establish my own thing. Is that without moving into the feared fundraising word amongst philanthropy, is that something that is considered amongst the diaspora? Thank you.
Okay. There's another hand down there.
Thank you very much. Keda Nicolas from Haiti. I have a foundation called the Haiti Community Trust, which is a transnational community foundation that is using an endowment somewhat model, but also at the same time making sure that we're supporting grassroots organizations. And we are mobilizing Haitians in the diaspora throughout, right, as a central component of building the funds in addition to friends of the country. And so I wanted to ask a question related to donors fatigue, and if you could address that a little bit.
Okay. And then there's one up there, sir. Then we can come to the panel.
Thank you very much to the panelists. Tsitsi from Agent Action Fund. Mine is not a question, but more of a comment. Looking at Zimbabwe, for example, it's estimated that between 2020 and 2021, more than 1 billion remittances were coming from the diaspora. So I see that as an opportunity, and possibly there is a need for us to invest more in terms of how we can harness diaspora investments towards gender equality initiatives. I think we need more studies, we need more understanding in terms of how we can actually catalyze some of those opportunities. That's my comment. Thank you.
Okay. Okay. Initially, you didn't want to ask. Now there are so many questions. Let's have one there.
Beautiful panelists, how are you? Thank you for shedding light in a very complex space. My name is Leah Kilenga Bay. I am from the Africa Sickle Cell Organization, the CEO, and most of our funding actually comes from individual donors and private sector funding. My question, two-part question. So how we have stopped the individual donations because we became fancy, but we want to initiate again, but we do not know where to start. So how, for those of us who want to open up that channel, how do we start? Especially some of us have family, but that family or that connection we have outside is not really interested in, fundraising or bothering themselves. Secondly, it is a known fact that Obama won the election because most of his funding came from Africa towards his campaign. Shock, shock. But anyway, how do we have cross-border funding in terms of how do we have Kenyans for Nigeria or Sierra Leoneans for Gabonians kind of funding? Because people associate with home. But if you want to target diaspora funding, but they're African, but they're not necessarily from your country, how do you target that? Thank you.
Okay. So maybe let's take those questions and see if we'll have time after this. Maybe we start over there.
All right. I will talk a little bit about philanthropists joining a part of a team and maybe donor fatigue and see where it goes from there. So I think that that has happened, but where it's important to understand is what is driving the philanthropists. So I helped a Nigerian businessman put together, to start a foundation, well, to really formalize his foundation in Nigeria, I guess 2 years ago. And we took them through a whole real exercise on like getting to the core of what his philanthropy looked like, what the real goal of him giving was, what the theory of change was going to be for this foundation that he wanted to put together. So I think the role of philanthropic advisors really should be to help philanthropists understand if there's something that already exists out there that they can just add to. More than likely, though, folks want their name, or they want they want to leave a legacy, and so you have to address that aspect of it to make it work. And where I've seen it work, I think the best is when there's a large challenge where philanthropists can come together and bring, you know, their pool of money and add it to another pool so that it's like a larger impact to address a really big challenge that they may or may not have been able to do with their own private foundation. So that's one. And then in terms of donor fatigue, I think that's a real thing, for sure. But I think that what happens is that when someone is personally connected to a mission and a vision, they will move mountains to action. And particularly, my sister, I'm from the Caribbean as well, when it comes to anything related to hurricanes, which is the reason why I left my island, I will move mountains to support. So I think what happens sometimes is we don't actually understand why people are giving. And that part is really, really critical, even when you're thinking about trying to re-engage individuals, which goes to the sickle cell question. You really have to understand what is driving the person. And if you can understand that and provide them an opportunity to buy into something, provide them an opportunity to give a pledge over time, because then you can continue to engage that individual, not just 1 year or one-off, but ask them, hey, can you give us $5,000 over 2 years? Or, you know, try and extend the amount of time, because what that means is then you get to go back to them. You get to re-engage them. You get to continuously nurture that relationship, and that could possibly grow into more dollars and more engagement from them, and possibly bringing other people along with them to fund your organization.
Yeah, Pauline?
I can pile on the individual funding, and I think also going, where are these individual funders? And it could be on existing platforms like Giving Tuesday, GoFundMe. In Kenya, we have Mchanga, so you can utilize, because they already have resources on how you can engage your constituents within those platforms. Thank you.
And also, there's something that we have to understand, whether we're talking about the continental diaspora or the global diaspora. Black people in general, especially African diaspora, we have our host countries and we have our home countries. And so when you think about asking, people who live in two different worlds are more likely to, one, there's challenges because of what we call the black tax. It's real. You have black tax where you have family responsibilities of giving back to your own home country, but then you're torn sometimes of wanting to give and to support in your host country. It's real. And many people oftentimes make a decision to give, either it's their home country, and then they give through the form of remittances, right? That's where that decision comes through. when you're thinking about who are the nationals who are living in your country. Like, is there a large population of Nigerians, for example, living in your country? Are they business owners? What are they doing there? Engage them and cultivate relationships with that community. So you have to start identifying these pockets of ethnic groups or nationalities that can support, because they are now living in your country, making money in your country, and you are their host country. So leverage that. That's a way of really, people don't do that. They just think, oh, Nigerians are here, Nigerians are there, or Ethiopians are here and Ethiopians are there, they won't give to us. But they're in your country. So they have a stake in the development, the growth of everything, because it affects them personally, it affects their families, it affects their businesses. So when you come from that angle of that we're all in this, you will find out that many, many people will be willing to give. And then you cultivate them as donors. So it's not just a one-off asking. It's how can we get them to continue to give? And that's one of the things that we leveraged. It's saying, you know what, we don't want you to give us just one time. And it allows for them to plan. They make a commitment. I will commit to giving 3 years in a row. And so we can say, all right, you've given 3 years in a row, you're planning for 3 years. And for us, we need to now work on how do we make sure it's 6 years and 10 years, and that they can give bigger. So there are different ways, but you have to understand the reason people give.
Okay. I think we have just 3 minutes, but I think there's a part of a question that I think we need to address, because the issue of closing the gender gap is not just a country, national problem. It's a universal problem, but also continental problem. And the issue was, how do you work with, let's say, Nigerians for Liberians, like giving across?
And that's what I was really trying to address, is Nigerians, let's be very honest, as a Nigerian, if I can't connect with your issue very well, theoretically, I would say, yes, I can give. But if uncle comes or sister comes from the other side and says, Omo, please, can you give to so, and so, I will give. That's the truth. I start with home. But if I am living in Rwanda and I know my home, my family, my business is here, I identify also with being a visitor here. So I'm more likely to give, to say, you know what, this particular area affects me and I can relate because I have a stake in here. So we have to really dig deep into identifying communities and alternative concepts of community.
Yeah, great. So there were 2 hands here. Let's just ask the questions. I don't know if they'll be able to respond. But let's just ask the questions. There are 3 hands there. Quick, if you can start from the back there, yeah.
Thank you so much for this amazing panel. So my question is actually on what you just mentioned that I think is so interesting about, oh, by the way, my name is Chantal, and I'm head of African Philanthropy Initiative for Save the Children. And the comment that you just made about the diaspora being very torn in giving in their home states and where they're from, I'm really curious to hear more how we actually mobilize the diaspora to care about issues beyond their home country, because we see, for instance, a lot of Americans do care about, for instance, what's happening in Ukraine, and they will give a large amount. So how do we mobilize the Africa diaspora to actually give on issues, whether it's gender equality or whether the hunger crisis that is happening in Ethiopia or across East Africa? So how do we mobilize them to care beyond their home country? Thank you.
There was a hand there, and then the gentleman here.
Good morning. My name is Janine Munyishuri, and I'm a Rwandan who has lived for the most of my life abroad. I personally do not like very much the word diaspora. I think you have just various communities of Africans living away from their home country. And it frames the conversation differently than being a diaspora. It's like a plug. But actually the plug does exist because we come from somewhere. The question would be for you, Omolola, and maybe Rashida. I am trying to share my own question to which I haven't had an answer. It seems, at least here, that we've been challenging the definition of philanthropy as we know it. And yet, when we relate to communities abroad, we come back to the very old concept of remittances. We come back to the same concept of pledges and donations and donors and beneficiaries. I am challenged, and I'm challenging you as we reframe the very way philanthropy works today to come with innovations or imagination or creativity, instead of saying that we are engaging these people, and as we know, everybody wants to give. Everybody wants to belong. What is it that has been missing so far in not going to knock at somebody's door, come and give? Omolola, you spoke about knowing what are people's interests, and Rashida, you spoke about knowing who your donor is. But what if these people were not all donors, but were stakeholders? And maybe it's the common project that is missing. Maybe it's the easy vehicle to work together that is missing. So I'm asking this question to you because I've been asking these questions to myself. And I gave answers that are related to myself. For instance, at some point, I came back home and worked here. And as you mentioned, I'm still very interested in contributing to boards or initiatives from places where I have been, so that my unique expertise and my belonging here and there works. So you see, my question is broad, but I feel like we haven't, or maybe we have, and I don't know, we haven't come up yet with these innovative, creative ideas on how to work together. And second, I think as African communities in the world, we should work more and more into becoming thought leaders. The thought leadership is kind of missing. Thank you.
Thank you. The last gentleman, if you could be brief as well. I know people are already looking at me. It's lunchtime.
I think to make this easier, I'm just going to turn mine into a comment and not a question. Because let's go fast. I just want to add to the fact that individual giving is seriously important. If you look at this from a logical standpoint, the majority of philanthropists in this room are over 30 years old. At the same time, the majority of nonprofit or organizations asking philanthropy for money are less than 5-10 years old. So if you are a philanthropy, right, that has been giving money out, chances are you have probably 5 to 10 additional organizations asking you for the same budget you have set for the past 10 years. So we have to diversify our individual giving in addition to requesting from philanthropists. Quickly, data and reports. It is not necessary for all of us to always go and find data. That is a lot of work. Visit givingtuesday.com. There is a data commons where there are 70 partners, 40 different giving platforms providing their data, raw data to Giving Tuesday. We do the analysis on them and we make them public. So you can go there and find out information as how many diasporans are giving to the diaspora by country. So that information exists today. And finally, I think we who live in the United States or outside of this country or outside of this continent, but are from Africa, I think we feel this continent. We have been focused so much on talking about the negative stereotypes that comes out of here about Africa, rather than us standing up in the US and saying, there are positive things happening in Africa and let's do something about it. And I think if we talk more about that, we'll be able to help you guys raise more money on the individual level. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So, actually, I'm not so sure. We don't have time. From what I was told, we should end at 1.
About his comment on data.
Okay, okay.
So when it comes to Giving Tuesday and all these other platforms, there's an aggregation of data that needs to be separated. It's not separated. The diaspora giving is really surface. It doesn't go as in-depth as it needs to because there's informal giving. For example, how many people here have given somebody in an envelope, let's say you're traveling, okay, when you get to Lagos or you get to someone, help me give someone this cash. Yeah. That's money that's not being tracked. So there's a huge aspect of informal giving when it comes to diaspora giving that we're not collecting. And we need to know, because if we're going to talk about how much we're giving, how much more we can give, and the other ways, maybe using technology, that's another thing that we haven't talked about enough. Technology. Rashida built a platform that was actually to really help diaspora organizations, diaspora individuals connect to local indigenous organizations. Storytelling, making sure that you're reaching the right people. It's being done in different ways. It's not easy, but it's being done. So I think I tried to address one or two comments there.
Yeah, let me be a bit brutal and end it here, because there's no way you're going to address the issue of innovations in the short space of time given. So can I ask everyone to join me in thanking the panelists? So thank you very much. This ended up being a resource mobilization masterclass as opposed to be another discussion. So thank you very much. Thank you. I think we should take...
Thank you very much, everyone, indeed. Now we are going to... we want to thank you, first of all, for your time. We are now going to break for lunch at Soko Restaurant. Now, during the lunch break, APF members and those who are interested in joining APF are going to meet at Mohazi, that is in